All right, our last solving method is the quadratic formula. So we're going to take one more look and finish this off of our fourth and final solving method. This solving method is great because it works on just about every problem. The only problem is it's a little bit long, and some of our other solving methods might be quicker. There is one condition that must be met before we start the quadratic equation, and it's not that it can't look like this before, but it has to look like this before we start it. Our equation must equal 0 before we start the problem, but the equation, as long as it has an x squared in it, can be solved using the quadratic formula. So the first thing we want to do is write down the quadratic formula, and then we'll have an example. So the quadratic formula says our answers, x, are going to equal the opposite of b plus or minus, and this plus or minus is where we end up with our two different answers, the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2 times a. Now for us to use this formula, we're going to have to look at an equation and figure out the number that we can replace the letter b with in these two positions, the number we can replace the letter a with in these two positions, and the number we can replace the letter c with here in this final spot. And then we can just plug it into our calculator, and we'll talk about the best strategies to plug it into our calc to get it right. So let's look at an example. So let's say it says solve 4x squared minus x equals 18. Now if we look at this problem, we notice that there's an x and an x squared, so we can't use the solve by taking roots method. The a value is not 1, so it's not easily factored, and we can't use completing the square without some extra tricks. And so this is why we know we're probably going to use the quadratic formula. So when we know we're going to use the quadratic formula, we have to make sure that we set the equation equal to 0 before we start. And if we look at this equation, it equals 18. It's not a big deal. We can get rid of the 18 because it's a positive 18. We can subtract it. But we have to get this right-hand side equal to 0 before we start. The only question is, where would I subtract that 18 from? Because this is an x squared and this is an x and this is just a plain constant, we're just going to subtract the 18 at the end, and then we can reset the equation. So our final equation is going to be 4x squared minus the x and then the minus the 18 equals 0, because 18 minus 18 is 0. And so now that our equation is equal to 0, now we can look for our a's, b's, and c's. Our a value is always going to be the number in front of the x squared, so a is equal to 4. Notice I do not have the squared in there. The a value is just the constant, the number in front, the coefficient, the number in front, and not anything to do with the x or x squared. So it's just a is equal to that number in front. B is equal to the number in front of the x. Now in this case it says subtract x. Well, we know if there's not a number, we can always put a 1 there. So this is going to be a b value of -1. If this said -4, then our b value would have been a -4. Whatever this number in front of the x is, that's our b value. And finally, our c value is our constant at the end, and so that's going to be -18. So when we go to rewrite this formula, everywhere we see a b, we're going to write -1. Everywhere we see an a, we're going to write a 4. And everywhere we see a c, we're going to write -18. So we're going to recopy this formula. And we are going to recopy it, changing all the letters, except for the x, because that's what we're solving for, into the numbers that we know they are. So it says x equals opposite of b, or negative b. So I come down here and I want the negative of -1. So the negative of -1 is +1. The opposite of -1 is another way you can read that. Plus or minus, so I'm going to copy down the plus or minus. Square root, I'm going to copy that down. And then b squared. So if I can do that in my head, I probably will. B is -1. -1 squared means -1 times itself. -1 times -1 is +1. So in that b squared part, I'm going to put a +1. Minus 4, it's always -4, multiplied by a multiplied by c. Now I use parentheses for multiplication just so I don't get confused on what's a subtract sign and what's a negative sign. So I'm just going to use parentheses for this multiplication. So after the 4, I'm going to put the a value. So my a value in this case is 4. So I'm going to put 4 in the a value spot. And then in the c value spot, after the a, I'm going to put -18. And all of that is going to get divided by 2a. So all of this is divided by 2 times my a value. And if I can do that in my head, I might as well. If a is 4, 2 times 4 is 8. And so this is the first kind of basic setup of how we're going to do the quadratic formula. Most of it from here is going to be calculator work. Although when I go to type in my calculator, what I'm going to type in my calculator is only the stuff inside the square root. I'm going to do that just so I don't mess up my order of operations, because it's easy to do. So I'm only going to type in my calculator this stuff right here, the stuff inside the square root. So notice when I bring up my calc, I'm actually not going to bring up a square root sign, because I want to do just the inside. So I'm going to start here with the 1 minus 4. You can use parentheses for times, or you could just use the times button. 4 times 4 times negative 18. And when I multiply that out, that gives me 289. 289 is the number that goes inside this square root. So I'm going to put the 289 inside the square root. And so now if you look at what I wrote, I have x equals still. I still have the 1. I still have the plus minus. I still have the square root. But now instead of all of this, I have 289. They call all of this, by the way, the discriminant. So if you ever hear someone talk about the discriminant, it's the inside of the square root. At this point, we're ready to kind of get our two answers. We can kind of just solve this now. Our x's are going to equal to 1 plus the square root of 289, all divided by 8. So we can start by doing that. 1 plus the square root. Now our square root is second, then the x squared button, 289. And I want to divide by 8, but I don't want to divide just this last number divide by 8. I want to divide this entire thing. So I'm going to hit enter to get the answer to the top. And now I'm going to divide by 8 to get this final answer. So one of my answers is 2.25. And then to get my other answer, instead of doing 1 plus the square root of 289, now I'm going to do 1 minus the square root of 289. So 1 minus the square root of 289. And just like last time, I'm going to just hit enter here and then divide by 8. Doing that doesn't mess up my order of operations. So I have that negative 16. I can't forget to divide it by that 8, and I get negative 2. So my two x values that would make this equation true are 2.25 and negative 2. All these quadratic formulas, some people always ask where this comes from. This is a formula that will always work. That is derived basically taking the basic ax squared plus bx plus c and completing the square with it. So this formula will always work as long as you have the right a's, b's, and c's. If you have questions, like always, just let me know. Good luck, and I hope all goes well.